Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. The Season 1 of War Within has officially kicked off, at least when it comes to Mythic Plus content, and already we're seeing a variety of different classes throwing themselves into these dungeons, throwing themselves against bosses, and certain few are actually starting to come out on top. And some are even seeing great performance at higher tier Mythic Plus content, which really kicks up the ante when it comes to difficulty, where at plus 10 difficulty we have the Tyrannical and the Fortified affix available at the same time, plus a bonus affix that makes dying even more punishing, which means perfect play is even more important. And things continue to only get even harder at plus 12 difficulty and above, so only a handful of specs can actually start to shine at that higher tier difficulty. I was interested to see which classes are performing the best so far within Season 1, and I wanted to share those findings with you so far, showcasing the most popular class spec choices right now during the early few weeks of the Season 1 War Within content. You know, in case you're looking to level a brand new character during the WoW's 20th anniversary, which is going to offer quite a solid EXP increase. As always, if you want to see more War Within videos like these on the channel, be sure to follow and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So to start this video off, I want to break it apart into specific class roles, starting with tanks, healers, and then the DPS classes, the melee and the range counterparts. So starting out with tanks, the most popular tank right now among all key levels as of this moment is a Blood Death Knight, which is technically the most popular pick, at least early on. It is a solid tank with frequent available defensive cooldowns, very fun gameplay, and a very decent output of damage that requires very little to set up. You just run in, pop your dancing room weapon, start going to town, dealing a decent bit of damage for Blood Death that's compared to previous expansions. You also have a fantastic control kit, maybe one of the best, with an AoE blind, soft interrupts with grips, as well as normal kicks. You can spec it to stuns, and you can spec it to plenty of slows, and Blood Death Knights have always been a very self-reliant tank. But with them nerfing all the tanks globally across the board during the development of the War Within expansion, Blood Death Knights did take a bit of a hit. Though anything above a plus 10 keystone does become a little bit more challenging for many tanks out there, and only a handful of them right now can survive some of the higher end dungeons, especially as we get into the plus 12 difficulty and above, where we get a brand new affix of Xal'atath Guile. Buffs that Xal'atath provides you throughout the dungeon are actually instead replaced with a buff to all of the enemies in the dungeon. Not only are you dealing with Tyrannical or Fortified, which not only increase the effectiveness of bosses and the trash packs in the dungeon, but Xal'atath's Guile additionally provides him with 20% more health and 20% more damage. So only the best of the best, most survivable tanks can survive that content this early on until everybody gets a little bit of gear. And the two tanks that are performing the best at some of the high-end, high-stress content will have to be the Bear Druid and the Protection Warrior. Bear Druid is arguably one of the easier tanks to get into, just generally from like a player perspective in terms of gameplay. They don't have the most busiest or the most difficult of a rotation, and they bring a fantastic mix of group utility from group-wide healing, stampeding roar, battle res, and their damage isn't that bad either once they get ramped up. Early on the damage starts out very slow, but once they get all the cooldowns rolling and everybody is dotted with a moonfire, then you really start to melt literally everything in front of you. Bear Druid is one of the tanks that actually sees some of the biggest benefits with the tank nerf that they saw recently. Even though Bear's Druid self-survivability with healing is impacted, they still have a massive array of defensive cooldowns to help mitigate damage, especially physical damage. They're kind of like a walking damage sponge, and that makes them highly effective at some of the higher end dungeons. The only other tank that can compete with the Bear Druid in some of the high end content right now is Protection Warrior, arguably the harder tank to pick up compared to the Bear Druid. But Protection Warriors are built with defense in mind, especially for some of the high-end content, since they're not built around self-healing like most other tanks are. Instead, they're built around trying to mitigate and reduce as much damage intake as possible, especially if they can block those attacks, usually of the physical variety. But as long as they can block it, they usually don't take a lot of damage, which makes it probably one of the easiest experiences for healers to heal a prot warrior in most cases. Though as a prop warrior, it does require quite a bit more knowledge in order to deal with certain counters, because if they can't block an attack, it's going to hurt a lot more than it has to. So anything like a damage over time effect or a magical effect that they don't have a block for, all those things are going to hit them harder than some of the other tanks out there, unless they have a defensive cooldown to roll with that hit, which does make them a little bit of a higher skilled tank to get into when it comes to endgame progression. Either way, they'll look like a very highly competitive option. From there on though, we can move on to the healing specs, and one of the easiest ones to get into for this season so far is the Restoration Shaman, no doubt about it. I think what helps Restoration Shamans become a little bit more considered is their buff of Sky Fury, which synergizes incredibly well with melee specific groups, but even casters enjoy the free 2% mastery that it provides. And having more raid buffs and utility to bring into a group, I think generally ends up being something that a lot of players value highly. And Shamans are filled with it. They have a lot of ways to stop enemies within AoE content, whether it is knocking them up in the air with a thunderstorm, dropping down a capacitor totem, they have interrupts, and they have plenty of totems to deal with variety of situations, such as Poison Cleansing Totem in order to provide a little bit more dispel protection for your allies, so they can deal with poisons, they can deal with curses, they can deal with magic damage, so they have everything but diseases under control. And because of the changes that happened to Restoration Shaman with Master of the Elements, you have better focused single target healing, so being able to spot heal any allies in your group becomes a much easier job for Resto, combined together with the healing over time and their totems, which do a lot of group-wide cleave healing. Out of all the healers in the game, this one is easily the most popular one by far in the current season of Mythic Plus, and has seen a lot of play at the high-end content and even low-end content. Restoration Shaman also has significant healing numbers behind it. That isn't the case for them season to season, as in previous expansions I've seen some seasons where they kind of drop off just because they're not numerically as significant as some of the other healers, but they're having a really good start early on at the very bare minimum. The only other healer that I think also worth highlighting, which is arguably one of the hardest healers to get into, but probably the one with even better numbers than that of a Restoration Shaman, is the Preservation Evoker healing spec. And really, their numbers right now, especially in large raid content, but even Mythic Plus, are very, very good. They're also a class filled with plenty of utility, with a great array of group cooldowns that are fantastic for 5-man content, but also great defenses for self as well as the party, and plenty of utility. The only thing that really makes Preservoker a little bit weird to play into, which is the range and positional requirements. Technically they can cast while on the move, but that also means that they have a shorter cast range compared to some of the other healers, and they have to kind of line up all of their allies in front of them in order to be able to be the most effective at healing. They technically have the numbers on their side, but they're a little bit harder to get into, but they still have an edge across some of the other healers available from Mythic Plus content. From there though, we can move on to the DPS classes, and starting out we have one of the more popular ranged options, which is the Arcane Mage. Arcane Mages saw a lot of popularity growing little by little over throughout the beta, and with them simplifying the playstyle a little bit, not giving it an overly complex rotation, it allows a lot more players to give Arcane Mage a try and start to perform well at it without needing some kind of like a script to follow when it comes to Mythic Plus dungeons. They have fantastic focus damage, which is something that's valued highly within Mythic Plus dungeons, thanks to the whole Touch of the Magi and the profile that allows them to really focus in on a singular target while cleaving everything around that target. This allows them to eliminate large danger targets within seconds easily, which makes certain dungeons much easier if you can eliminate that one threatening target out of a pack of just really meandering enemies that are just damage sponges more than anything. Currently, Arcane Mages are seeing a lot of popularity pretty early on, but potentially with better gear and with some more class tuning, we could see a swing to some of the other range classes, because a lot of them are actually very close to Arcane Mage. We're just seeing Arcane Mage slightly ahead of everybody else when it comes to that Mythic Plus representation and high-end content. But there is still one range class that's probably seeing even more play than the Arcane Mage, and that is the Augmentation Evoker, which is, I would actually say, is a highly accessible, easy to pick up spec that anybody can get into. It is getting play at a low level, but also a lot of play at the high level as well. It's a spec that's all about buffing your party instead of doing damage yourself, which allows you to focus on buffing everybody around you, letting him focus on doing damage while you focus on the mechanics, knocking enemies up, landing those interrupts, doing some spot healing for your group, and providing mostly support-based gameplay instead of you having to focus on doing the most amount of damage to a boss or an encounter. Augmentation Evokers also have a little bit of advantage in a couple of fronts. One, they are really good at high-end content as the global tank nerfs, because they make tanks even tankier. That allow them to gain a little bit more armor, and they empower them with additional primary stat, which generally makes most tanks more effective at being able to intake damage or better at mitigating damage if anything. But also they have the flexibility where they are a ranged class that allows your group to have mostly a melee heavy makeup, because melee are actually quite strong early on in season 1. And there's a couple of melee that we'll mention here in a second, but it allows Augmentation Evoker to be paired with those melee, so they can be the ranged doing majority of the mechanics or targeted by mechanics, and it can do it pretty easily with their easy rotation, but allowing you to bring more melee that can absolutely decimate all dungeon content out there. Now when it comes to melee classes, there's a lot of viable and powerful options out there, from rogues, red paladins, even warriors, but the two melee specs that stand out the most from the crowd, one in terms of popularity, would have to be the Frost Death Knight, which right now are, even though they got nerfed a couple of times in the beta, I would still say they're numerically significant enough to be brought in for some of the high-end content. Like Frost Mages that have great priority damage that results in free cleave, allowing them to focus down the large, powerful, dangerous foes, while also being able to slay everything else around them for free. They have a fantastic array of defensive options and crowd control similar to that of a Blood Death Knight, and right now they're well built for high-end content and are performing relatively well. No matter how many nerfs I saw in the beta, players kept playing them on the beta, and it looks like that's one of the few specs that had a lot of popularity on the beta that translated incredibly well into the live realms. This isn't true for all, like Survival Hunter is another one that also saw a lot of play in the beta, but didn't translate nearly as well as Frost Death Knight did. And with Frost Death Knight seeing even more updates in the patch 11.05 with the Deathbringer, I really think if you're not playing a Death Knight, or if you don't have a Death Knight as an alt right now, you definitely should get one up and running because they're doing incredibly good as of this moment. The only other melee classes performing maybe better than Frost Death Knight, or at least highly competitive compared to Frost Death Knight at high-end content, would be Enhancement Shaman, which have significant damage tuning currently when it comes to Season 1 of endgame progression. And I've seen a lot of groups looking for Enhancement Shamans in particular, but that's mostly because right now their numbers allow them to have the very best kit for both AoE and single target. If you're looking to bolster your group with some additional damage, Enhancement Shaman is generally the go-to spec right now. They do have a fairly high skill cap to play perfectly, and requires quite a bit of setup if you really want to fully maximize the value of that Tempest gameplay, the Stormbringer enhancement gameplay. But if you're able to refine on those skills, Enhancement Shamans can in particular hold some of the best damage out there from a melee counterpart. Like I said though, there's plenty of other melee that are doing pretty well at the beginning of the season. They're actually fairly close, very similar to the setup we have for the ranged DPS classes. But if I had to pick out the two melee that are doing the best right now at the overall as well as the high-end content, Frost DK would take the cake in the overall department, while Enhancement Shamans are doing incredibly good and a quite popular pick when it comes to some of the higher end tier content. But remember, just because a class or spec isn't featured in this video doesn't mean that it's doing poorly. In fact, tuning isn't final and some classes really open up once they get a little bit more gear. And also, you don't necessarily need to play any of these classes to get your plus 10 keystones out or get to KSM. Just about every single spec and class is built to be able to accomplish those goals. But as with all things, certain playstyles are seeing a lot of popularity early on, and that's what I primarily wanted to highlight in today's video, featuring classes that are seeing a lot of play at a variety of different levels of content, but also some that are seeing a bit more preference in some of the higher end instances. But with that being said, I do want to thank you guys so much for watching this video, and hopefully you enjoyed. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community to discuss which class you're hoping gets better performance or tuning as the season 1 goes on, or let me know all those thoughts in the comments down below. As per always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see all of you guys in the next one.